My parents stole my $500,000 inheritance, kicked me out, and called me a failure. Years later, I got my revenge while they lost everything. Alright, Reddit. Buckle up because this is a story I've been sitting on for a while, and now I think it's time to share. My name's Jake, and this whole ordeal started when I turned 18. Growing up, it was just me, my mom, Linda, my dad, Mark, and my little sister, Katie. We weren't exactly wealthy, but we were comfortable enough. I was pretty close with my grandpa, Henry. He was the cool, wise old guy who always had crazy stories about his younger days and a knack for slipping me advice without making it feel like advice. We got along like best friends. When I hit 18, my life flipped upside down. Grandpa had passed away about a year before, and on my birthday, his lawyer reached out to me. I didn't think much of it, figured it was something small like a keepsake or a letter. But no. This dude sits me down and tells me my grandfather left me $500,000 in his will. $500,000. Apparently, Grandpa had been saving for decades, and he wanted me to have it. Said he saw potential in me and wanted me to chase my dreams. I didn't even get to sit with the news for 5 minutes before my parents found out. Somehow, they must have overheard or snooped, doesn't matter. The second I got home, Linda and Mark were waiting for me. My dad asked about the meeting, and when I hesitated to tell him, my mom snapped. "Don't lie to us, Jake. We know Henry left you money. Our money." That's when things took a turn I didn't expect. I told them the truth, but I made the mistake of saying I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the money yet. I thought that would buy me some time to think. Nope. My dad immediately starts ranting about how Grandpa's money should have gone to them, not me. He said something like, "We're the ones who took care of him when he got old. You're just a kid. What do you even know about handling that kind of money?" My mom was no better. She was practically pacing, talking about all the bills they had, how this money could save the family. It was surreal. Like I wasn't their son anymore. I was just a walking bank account. I tried to stand my ground and said, "Grandpa left it to me for a reason. He wanted me to use it to start my life, not fix your problems." Big mistake. My dad slammed his hand on the table and yelled, "You're not worthy of that money, Jake. You'll waste it." My mom jumped in too, calling me selfish, and saying I was turning my back on the family. That's when I realized this wasn't a conversation. They weren't looking for my input. The next day, they cornered me again. This time, it wasn't yelling, it was guilt trips and manipulation. My mom cried, saying, "If you really loved us, you'd help us. Don't you want to make sure Katie has a good life?" And my dad, all smug, was like, "We can invest it for you, Jake. You're too young to understand how money works." I was fed up, so I told them no again, and that was it. That's when they pulled the rug out from under me. 3 days later, I came home to find my stuff packed up in boxes on the porch. My dad was waiting in the driveway, arms crossed. "If you don't trust us with the money, then you don't belong under this roof," he said. My mom poked her head out the door and shouted, "Good luck surviving out there without our help. Let's see how far Grandpa's money gets you." They kicked me out. Just like that. And the worst part? They took the money. Apparently, Grandpa's will had a loophole. Since I was 18, they'd been named as temporary trustees for the inheritance. I didn't even get a chance to fight for it before they drained the account. I was homeless, broke, and completely alone. But this isn't the end of the story. Not even close. So there I was, 18 years old, sitting on the curb with nothing but a couple boxes of my stuff and the clothes on my back. My parents didn't just take my inheritance, they took everything. I had no savings, no job, and no plan. I crashed at a friend's house for a couple of weeks, but I couldn't stay forever. I ended up sleeping in my car for a while, eating fast food when I could afford it, and stretching every dollar I made from odd jobs. It was humiliating. The worst part? My parents didn't even care. My mom texted me once, just to rub it in. "I hope you're learning a lesson about being ungrateful." For a while, I thought they'd won. But I wasn't going to stay down forever. I had a point to prove, and I wasn't about to let them destroy me. After a couple of months of scraping by, I finally caught a break. I landed a job at a local hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, And the manager, Bill, was one of those rare people who actually cared. He saw how hard I was working and gave me extra hours whenever he could. I also started doing handyman work on the side, fixing fences, patching walls, that kind of thing. It didn't pay much at first, but word spread, and soon I had regular clients. Every dollar I earned felt like a victory. During this time, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to thrive. My parents thought I'd crumble without them, but I was determined to prove them wrong. I started saving like crazy, living on instant noodles and second-hand clothes. I also began teaching myself new skills online, everything from basic accounting to home renovation. Slowly but surely, I was building something. And the best part? I knew that one day, I'd get to show my parents just how wrong they were. By the time I hit 20, I was in a completely different place. Between my job at the hardware store and my growing side business, I had saved enough to rent a small studio apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one could take it from me. Around this time, I started getting bigger handyman gigs, renovating kitchens, building decks, even small landscaping projects. The more I worked, the more people recommended me. Eventually, I decided to go all in and officially started my own business. Jake's Fix It All. Turns out, all those hours I'd spent working with Grandpa in his workshop weren't just bonding time, they were training. I realized I had a knack for this stuff, and before long, I wasn't just scraping by, I was thriving. By the time I turned 21, I had upgraded to a nicer apartment, bought a decent truck, and had a small team of workers helping me out. And the best part? I was completely independent. I didn't need a cent from anyone. But even as I was climbing the ladder, I kept one thing in the back of my mind, my parents. I knew their little house of cards would collapse eventually. I just didn't know when. It wasn't until I was 23 that I first heard about my parents' troubles. I ran into an old neighbor, Mrs. Carter, while picking up supplies. She casually asked, "Have you heard about your folks? Things aren't looking so good for them." I played dumb and asked what she meant. Apparently, my dad's business had taken a nosedive, and they were struggling to keep up with their bills. Rumor had it they were on the verge of losing the house. Hearing that should have made me feel bad, right? But honestly, it didn't. These were the same people who left me on the street and stole my future without a second thought. If karma was finally catching up to them, so be it. Still, I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to face them yet. Instead, I focused on growing my business. I just scored a huge commercial contract, and things were taking off faster than I'd ever imagined. Every milestone felt like another middle finger to my parents, even if they didn't know it yet. But trust me, their day was coming. A few months after hearing about my parents' troubles, I got an unexpected text from my sister, Katie. She was 19 now and still living with my parents. We hadn't talked much since I got kicked out. She was just a kid back then, caught in the middle of everything. Her message said, "Hey Jake. Can we talk? It's about Mom and Dad." I didn't reply at first. I wasn't sure I wanted to open that door. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop. When I walked in, she looked different, older, more tired. She didn't waste any time. "Jake, things are bad. Dad's business is gone, and they've got no savings. They're fighting all the time, and the house is in foreclosure," she said. Her voice cracked a little. "They keep saying it's your fault." That made me laugh out loud. "My fault? How is any of this on me?" She sighed. "They say if you'd given them the money when they asked, none of this would have happened." I couldn't believe it. Even after all these years, they still refused to take responsibility for their actions. I told Katie the truth about what happened back then, how they took everything and left me with nothing. She looked shocked. "They said you blew the money on partying and ran off," she admitted. I didn't know what to believe. Hearing that stung more than I expected. Not only had they stolen my inheritance, but they'd also trashed my name to my own sister. I told her everything, how I'd struggled, how I'd built myself back up, and where I was now. Katie listened quietly, then asked, "Do you think you could help them? Even a little?" I stared at her for a long moment before saying, "I'll think about it." But in my head, I already knew the answer. I wasn't going to bail them out. Not after everything they'd done. But I also wasn't done with them yet. If they wanted to see how much they'd underestimated me, they were about to get their wish. Katie kept texting me over the next few weeks, giving me updates on the situation at home. My parents were desperate. My dad was working odd jobs to keep the lights on, and my mom was trying to sell off whatever she could, but it wasn't enough. Then one day, Katie dropped a bombshell. They're talking about reaching out to you. I think they want to apologize, or at least pretend to. That was all I needed to hear. If they wanted to play nice to get something out of me, I was ready to give them a front row seat to the life they said I'd never build. I told Katie to arrange a meeting, making it clear that I wasn't agreeing to anything, just showing up to hear them out. We set a date, and I made sure to make an entrance they wouldn't forget. On the day of the meeting, I pulled up to their crumbling house in my brand new truck, sleek, shiny, and unmistakably expensive. I stepped out in a tailored suit, something I'd never been able to afford before, and walked up to the door like I owned the place. Katie opened it, looking nervous. "They're in the living room," she said. I walked in, and there they were, Linda and Mark, sitting on a worn-out couch with the same smug expressions I remembered. But now, there was something else, desperation. "Jake," my mom started, her voice sugary sweet. "We're so glad you came. We've missed you." My dad nodded, adding, "We made some mistakes, son, but we're still family. Maybe we can move past all that." I didn't even sit down. I just stood there, arms crossed, letting them squirm. "Miss me? That's funny. Last time I was here, you were throwing my stuff onto the porch and telling me I wasn't worthy of anything." My mom's face flushed, and my dad tried to laugh it off. "That was years ago. We've all grown since then. Have you?" I asked, glancing around the room. It was clear they hadn't. Their world was falling apart, and they thought I'd swoop in to save them. I could see the discomfort growing, and it was exactly what I wanted. This wasn't about revenge, okay, maybe a little, but mostly, it was about showing them the person I'd become. And trust me, I wasn't done yet. After a long, awkward silence, my dad finally cracked. "Look, Jake, we're in a tough spot. The business went under, and the bank's coming for the house. We've tried everything, but—" He trailed off, waiting for me to jump in and offer a solution. I didn't. Instead, I leaned against the doorway and said, "Tough spot, huh? Sounds familiar. Kind of like when you kicked me out with nothing and took the money Grandpa left me." My mom's face tightened. "Jake, we've explained this before. You weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. We did what we thought was best." I couldn't help but laugh. "You mean you drained the account and left me homeless? That's what you thought was best?" Katie, who had been hovering in the corner, quietly said, "They didn't even use it for anything good, Jake. They wasted it." That hit a nerve. My dad snapped. "Don't start with that, Katie. We had to survive. That money went to keep this family afloat." "Did it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sinking ever since." My mom tried to shift the conversation. "Jake, please. Let's not dwell on the past. What's important is that we're here now, as a family. If we all work together." I cut her off. "You're only reaching out because you're broke. Let's not pretend this is about family. If Grandpa were here, he'd be disgusted." That one landed hard. My dad stood up, pointing a finger at me. "Watch your mouth, Jake. You don't know what it's like to struggle as a parent. We did what we had to do." "Yeah?" I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket. "Well, while you were struggling, I was out building something." I opened up a picture of my latest project, a $1 million custom home I just finished renovating for a client. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table, letting them see the sprawling property. "This is what I've been doing while you were busy blaming me for your failures." Their jaws dropped. My dad picked up the phone, scrolling through the photos, while my mom just sat there speechless. Katie, meanwhile, had a small, proud smile on her face. "I came here to show you what I built," I said. "Not to bail you out. You don't deserve that." For the first time in my life, my parents looked genuinely speechless. And honestly, it felt good. The silence in the room was deafening. My dad kept staring at the pictures on my phone like they might suddenly change into something less impressive. My mom, on the other hand, was trying to regain her composure. "Jake," she said softly, her tone dripping with fake humility. "We're so proud of you. Grandpa would be, too. You've really turned things around." "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Without any help from you." She flinched at that, but before she could respond, my dad butted in. "Look, Jake, we get it. You've done well for yourself. But family is family. You can't just turn your back on us." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that I barely recognized as mine. "Turn my back on you? That's rich coming from the people who abandoned me when I needed you the most." My mom's voice rose, her mask starting to crack. "We didn't abandon you, Jake. You were being selfish. You wouldn't share what should have been the family's money. We had no choice." "No choice?" I shot back, my anger finally boiling over. "You had a choice. You chose yourselves. You chose greed. And now you're paying for it." Katie stepped forward, trying to mediate. "Guys, this isn't helping. Can we just—" But my dad wasn't having it. "Fine," he snapped. "If you're going to hold a grudge, then go ahead and leave. We don't need your charity." I smirked. "That's the thing, Dad. I wasn't planning to offer it. I came here to show you what you lost. To remind you that you threw away the son who would have had your back. You made your bed, now lie in it." I turned to Katie and softened my tone. "If you ever need help, you know where to find me. But them?" I motioned to my parents. "They're on their own." I grabbed my phone and headed for the door. My mom called after me, her voice cracking. "Jake, wait. Don't go, please." But I didn't look back. As I stepped outside, the weight I'd been carrying for years started to lift. They'd taken everything from me once, but not this time. This time, I walked away on my terms. Driving away from that house felt surreal. Part of me thought I'd feel guilty, but instead I felt free. For years, I'd carried the resentment, the hurt, and the anger they'd left me with, but now it was like a weight had been lifted. I finally got the closure I didn't know I needed. A week later, Katie called me. I was half expecting her to tell me my parents had spun some wild story about our meeting, but instead she said, "Jake, I think you were right to walk away." That stopped me in my tracks. "What do you mean?" "They're still blaming you for everything," she said. "Even after you showed them how far you've come, they're acting like you owe them something. Mom keeps saying you'll come around eventually, but I don't think they're ever going to change." Hearing that hit harder than I thought it would. I told Katie, "You don't have to stay there, you know. You're an adult now. You can leave if you want." There was a long pause before she replied, "I've been thinking about it. But I don't know where I'd go." That's when I made a decision. "You can come stay with me," I said. "At least until you figure things out." She sounded hesitant at first, but by the end of the call, she'd agreed. A few days later, she showed up at my place with just a suitcase and a backpack. "They didn't even notice I was packing," she said with a sad smile. I let her crash in the spare room and told her she could stay as long as she needed. For the first time in years, I felt like I actually had family again, someone who cared about me, not just what I could give them. As for my parents, I heard through the grapevine that they lost the house a few months later. No one knows where they ended up, and honestly, I don't care. I spent too long trying to earn their approval, but I finally realized it's not worth it. Katie and I are doing just fine without them. Having Katie move in with me was an adjustment, but a good one. At first, she seemed a little lost, understandable after everything she'd been through. She wasn't used to making her own decisions, let alone living somewhere her every move wasn't controlled or criticized. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now," she admitted one night over dinner. I shrugged. "Whatever you want. Get a job, take some classes, figure out what makes you happy. You've got time." That seemed to hit her harder than I expected. "No one's ever said that to me before," she muttered, poking at her food. Watching her slowly find herself was rewarding in a way I didn't expect. She got a part-time job at a bookstore, and for the first time, she started talking about her dreams, like maybe going back to school or opening her own little business someday. It reminded me of how I felt when I first started rebuilding my life. Katie also started opening up about what life had been like after I was kicked out. It was awful, she said one night. They fought constantly. Mom blamed Dad for losing the money, and Dad blamed you for not giving it to them. They acted like I didn't even exist half the time. Hearing that made me feel guilty, even though I knew I wasn't to blame. You know I would have taken you with me if I could, right? She nodded. I know. But I'm here now, and that's what matters. It wasn't easy, but little by little Katie started to thrive. Seeing her grow into her own person felt like a win, not just for her, but for me too. For the first time in years, it felt like we were both free of the mess our parents had created. And that freedom? It was priceless. A few months after Katie moved in, things were finally starting to settle. She was doing well at her bookstore job, and I was in the middle of expanding my business, adding new clients, and even considering opening a second location. Life was good. Then one Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured it might be a delivery or a neighbor. But when I opened the door, I froze. Standing there, looking worn and defeated, were my parents. Jake, my mom started, her voice shaky. We need to talk. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at them. They looked completely different from the last time I'd seen them. My dad, who used to always look polished and confident, seemed tired and aged, with clothes that looked like they hadn't been ironed in weeks. My mom, usually so put together, looked fragile, almost unrecognizable. What do you want? I finally asked, keeping my tone cold. My mom's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't bite. We have nowhere else to go, she said. We lost the house, and no one else will help us. I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe. So now you're here? After everything you did, you think I'm just going to let you waltz back into my life? We're your parents, my dad said, his voice firm but desperate. We made mistakes, sure, but we're still family. Katie appeared behind me, standing just inside the doorway. Oh, now we're family? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. That seemed to throw them off. My mom stammered. Katie, we didn't know you were here. We were worried about you. Katie crossed her arms. You didn't notice I was gone for weeks. You weren't worried about me, you were too busy blaming Jake for your problems. I could see the realization hit them. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Jake, my dad said, trying a different approach. We're not asking for much. Just a little help to get back on our feet. I let out a short laugh. You mean like the help you gave me when you kicked me out? When you took the money Grandpa left me and spent it all? That kind of help? My mom broke down sobbing, but I wasn't moved. Please, Jake, she said. We don't have anyone else. I stared at them for a long moment, then said, You're right. You don't have anyone else. And that's on you. With that, I stepped back and closed the door in their faces. Katie and I stood there in silence for a moment, listening as they shuffled away. Are you okay? She asked softly. Yeah, I said, taking a deep breath. I'm better than I've been in years. And for the first time in a long time, I really meant it. After that knock on the door, I thought I might feel guilty, but I didn't. Instead, I felt relieved. For the first time, I'd stood my ground and refused to let them manipulate me. Katie, though, seemed conflicted. Do you think we were too harsh? She asked later that night. I shook my head. They made their choices, Katie. We're not responsible for fixing their mess. You and I, we've earned the lives we're building. They're just dealing with the consequences of how they treated us. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she was still processing it. We didn't talk about it much after that. Instead, we focused on what mattered, moving forward. My business was thriving, Katie was figuring out her own path, and for the first time in years, we both felt like we were free of the shadows our parents had cast over our lives. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was living. And neither of us planned to look back. A year passed, and life kept getting better. My business expanded to a second location, and I hired more people than I ever thought I'd need. Katie started taking night classes in business management, with dreams of opening her own bookstore one day. We didn't hear from our parents again. At first, Katie would occasionally check social media to see what they were up to, but there wasn't much. They'd completely disappeared from the circles they used to run in. Eventually, she stopped looking, and neither of us felt the need to bring them up. One evening, after celebrating another big contract, Katie and I sat on the balcony of my new house. She looked out over the city lights and said, "It's crazy, isn't it? How far we've come." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "It is." For the first time, I felt like my life wasn't about proving anything to anyone, not my parents, not society, not even myself. It was about living for me and helping Katie build a future she deserved. They thought they'd taken everything from me, but they'd only pushed me to build something better. And I did.